This lecture is an introduction to the graph editor where we can refine our animations that bit further. Okay, so I'm in a new startup file and I'm going to select the light and the camera and delete those both because we don't really need them. I'm going to add in a floor for our cube. So Shift A to add, mesh plane, and I'll scale that up so it's nice and big. And with the cube, I'll move it above the floor. So G, Z, and then 1 and press enter. And that's now sitting on top of the floor. And I'm going to duplicate this cube. So Shift D and then in the Y axis. So Shift D, then Y, and move that across so they're next to each other like this. And you can always move them into the middle a bit more if you like. Okay, so just pause the video and catch up with me making two cubes that are on a plane as a floor. Okay, so now I want to animate my cubes. I want them to start on this side of the floor and finish up on this side of the floor. So just animating in the X-axis across the floor. And I want the animation to last 2 seconds. So, quick challenge to you, pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, well, I'll bring out my timeline a little bit more so we can see what's happening. I'll press the record button now. That way any movement I do will be recorded. So G, then X, move that across to the start over here. I'll change my end time to 48. So it's going to take 2 seconds. Move my playhead to 48 and G, then X, and move those across to the other side. And if I scrub across my timeline, we can see them both moving there. So hopefully you got an okay with that. Now I want to look at different ways that we can edit our animation. And for this, let's take a look at the animation workspace. Now immediately it's not that much different. We have our perspective here. So there's our two cubes. I may as well move around to this side so we can see them move across easily. We've got the dope sheet at the bottom here and then the timeline underneath that. And the dope sheet, remember, has very slightly different things than the timeline, although they are very similar. I'm just going to press N on my keyboard to get rid of the side panel here. We don't need that. And over here we have an extra window, which is just the viewport, but in this case, it's got the overlays turned off. So the overlays can be a little bit distracting. So it's turned off so we can see what the animation looks like without them. A lot of the time I'll have this window set so it's got material preview mode as well. And then I can see my animation in a little bit more detail. But for now, that's not important. So I'll go back to viewport shading. I'm going to bring the dope sheet up a little bit further so we can see both our cubes here. So we've got cube and cube 001. And if I click on them independently, you can see them change down here. And if I click on them both together, we get both objects in our timeline. And remember, the summary keyframe will select everything in our scene. Whereas if I click on the object keyframe, that will only select the keyframes for that one object. Now, what I really want to show you is the graph editor. And you can actually access the graph editor very quickly by moving your mouse over the dope sheet and pressing Control Tab. And in a sense, it's a more detailed look at our animation. What I'm going to do though is press Control Tab again and go back to the dope sheet and bring out an extra window so we can have them next to each other. Because our animation isn't particularly long, and I can zoom into my animation, make this kind of the full screen of the dope sheet, and here as well with my dope sheet on this side. And to easily resize, you can hold down Control or middle mouse button and move left and right, and press Control Tab to change it to the graph editor. I'll press N to get rid of my side panel, and I'll just zoom out a touch so we can easily see all our curves in here. Now at first glance, this might look a bit confusing, but I'll select just one of the cubes for now to make it a little bit more simple so we don't see all the curves and keyframes. And I'll open up the object transforms here in the graph editor and the object transforms in the dope sheet. Now immediately you can see, because we had the record button enabled, we've got all this extra data that we don't really need. In fact, the only thing we need is the X location. So I'm going to select the Y location all the way down to the Z scale by holding down Shift and press Delete. So we're left with this one X location. And notice when I click on that, it selects it in the graph editor as well. And that's this curve here. I'll just undo that for one quick moment and show you that all the other ones were flat down here. They may be in different positions, but they're all flat, showing that there's no actual animation on them. So I'll get rid of those again. And we've got our X location. So before we go any further, it's a good time now to catch up with me, going into the animation workspace and setting up your scene in the same way as I've done here, and deleting all the channels that we don't need apart from the X location. And do that for the second cube as well as a slight challenge. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I've got my second cube selected, and hopefully you remembered, we just open these up and we can select either in the dope sheet, or I can come across to the graph editor as well, location down to the Z scale, and delete those channels. And we're left with just this X location here. And if I click on the curve, you can see that the X location there has been selected. So I'm in that channel. It's also worth noting we've got an eye at the front there. And we can turn on and off visibility. I could have just turned off the visibility of the other channels, but it's much tidier to have just the X location. And if I click on both of these, one after the other, you can see the curve is the same, and I can actually click on them at the same time. We've got both these curves now selected, and they are right on top of each other because they have precisely the same animation. So still with them both selected, I'm going to go to our first cube. That should be the one closest to us. And I'm going to select the location keyframe and move that across to frame 24. And you can see my curve changes here. So it goes down from about -8 here up to roughly +8 here and covers the same distance as the second one here, but it just does it much faster. So if I go to frame 1 and press play, you can see it gets to the end much faster. So I'll pause that and go back to frame 1. So again, now's a good time to catch up with me and try that out for yourself. Okay, so what about if I wanted to shorten the distance that it travels? Well, again, on the first cube, the one closest to us, I'll select just that one point, and notice when I select either of these, it changes the keyframes over in the dope sheet as well. So I have the location keyframe on frame 24 selected. I can press G then Y. Remember, this is just X and Y as the axis because it's 2D. And I'll bring that down to 0 here. And then I'll play the animation. So it moves quickly to the middle and then stops. So I'll pause that. So you can change the position and location of your objects within the graph editor. So once again, now's a good time to catch up with me and change the location of your second keyframe for the original cube. Okay, so hopefully you found that fairly straightforward. And now I'll give you a further challenge. I want you to reposition the keyframes in the graph editor so that both cubes start at -10 for the X and they finish at +10, and that's on frame 48. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully that didn't catch you out at all. So this is the original cube's keyframe, and I'll move that so it's roughly on top of the other one up there. And I can zoom into this and make sure they're precisely on top of each other. Select them both, and G then Y, move those up to 10. So a little bit rough is just fine. I'll zoom out and I'll go to the bottom here, select those, zoom in a bit, and G then Y, and move those down to -10. So it's nice and straightforward. And if we play our animation, they should go at exactly the same speed and finish at the same point. So hopefully you got an okay with that. We will be continuing with this scene in the next lecture, so do make sure you've saved your work here.